Hi, and welcome to a new round, a new edition of the Business and Human Rights course. I'm delighted that this is the second year that Oxfam India and the Human Rights and Business Academy has come together to do this course. Last year we had a face-to-face course over 5 days in Delhi, and something similar we had planned. But unfortunately, like every other plan that has sort of had to be reshaped, we did the same thing, and this has become kind of an opportunity for us, because unlike previous years, this year we've been able to expand the course by going virtual, and now we have 250 attendees here and hundreds more on Facebook Lives. So thank you all for joining in for this webinar course, and thank you for the overwhelming response that we've received. We've received more than 1,200 registrations for the first webinar and countless more for the others. As you all know, that this is a course that we are doing over the period of 5 days, 10 webinars over 5 days, 1.5 hours each, twice a day. And there is a very clear sequence to these webinars, and as you probably have seen through in our brochure, that we really recommend that you follow the sequence. But of course, for the reasons we're all working from home, and there are 100 other things that are pulling us in different directions, so you may also pick and choose the ones that fit your schedule. For the first webinar today, the topic is From CSR to BHR, Old Wine in New Bottle. And on this really sort of, a very appropriate first webinar topic, I am joined with SURYA, who many of you know is an associate professor at the City University's Law Department and a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And he is joined by JUSTINE Nolan. She's a professor at the University of New South Wales, as well as a visiting fellow at the NYU's Stern School of Business. So without further ado, I hand it over to our esteemed speakers and experts, and I hope you all enjoy the show, the webinar. And after the webinar, the presentations will be emailed to all the participants, and you will be able to access the video at a later stage, and we'll intimate you about all of that. But for now, SURYA and JUSTINE, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tree. I hope everyone can hear me. Hello, everyone. So we are going to now start. I see some questions that you're not able to hear. I think you need to adjust your audio settings in your computer, and the slides will be emailed to all of you after we finish this webinar, so no need to copy the slides, and this recording will also be posted online later on, so no need to worry about that. We would like to make it quite dynamic, so please use the questions tab to ask us questions, post a comment, and we will try to take some of these questions as we go forward. So Justine, so let us start, and we are going to do it in a dynamic manner. And the first issue that I would like to bring is that before we start discussing about what is business and human rights, we want to hear from you. What is your impressions? What comes to your mind when you hear the term like CSR, corporate social responsibility, or BHR, business and human rights responsibility? What is your impressions? Anyone? Can you use your questions tab?
Yes, I think some questions are coming in. For me, one thing I always think about is sort of what was going on probably nearly 20 years ago, when particularly where was the rise of interest in sweatshops and the production of apparel and shoes in Indonesia and Vietnam. That one always jumps to me.
And I see someone writing sustainable development in business, and someone saying individual responsibility, someone talking about CSR and obligation by government. CSR is basically creating something, shared value with the society, so there are different sort of reflections that people are sharing about it. Someone talking about social responsibility issues are there. So I think that gives a fair sense that many of you have some basic understanding of what CSR is, what BHR is, and we are going to unpack this more. So let us move on. Now, this concept of business and human rights is relatively new. Maybe last 20, 30 years, we have started using it, but the idea is not very new. I don't know if you have read this book by William Dalrymple. His book about the anarchy traces the British East India Company, which is more than 400 years back. And it documents the kind of issues that we will identify today as business and human rights. But of course, in 1600, those issues were not considered BHR, because you will recall even Universal Declaration of Human Rights was not there, right? So I think that is the starting point. So what is BHR? In short, BHR is a dynamic field which is evolving very fast, almost every day, I would say, and it is about the intersection of business with human rights. It has so many dimensions, but on this slide you will see some of these dimensions. I think the starting point is that businesses are not here merely to maximize profit for shareholders. Of course, they have to make profit, but that is not their only duty or responsibility. They have to look to the wider society and the rights holders which have human rights. And this responsibility is independent of the responsibility that states may have in this particular field. And how do you do it? How do you respect human rights? And I think now it is very widely accepted that businesses respect human rights by conducting human rights due diligence. And you will hear this term again and again in this course. And access to remedy and corporate accountability are also a very key component. I see some questions which are technical in nature, that who will keep the attendance and all this. I think Oxfam team should be able to take care of those questions. Try to learn, forget about the attendance. If you are here 90 minutes, you will get the certificate. So don't become what I call to my students as well, do not focus on the grade. You will get the certificate, but that is not the significant part, okay? The crucial issue is that you enjoy and ask questions to us and try to learn more. Now, how BHR is different from CSR, because all of you know what CSR is. And again, CSR and BHR, there are so many different ways to define it. They are perhaps interrelated. They are perhaps two parallel fields. And on this slide, you see this very famous Carroll's pyramid of CSR, that these are economic responsibilities and legal responsibilities that they have to do. And then being ethical and being a good corporate citizen, philanthropic, is something which companies can decide what to do and what not to do. So let me try to unpack a bit that what this relationship could mean. In my view, CSR, and I would like to ask Justine if she agrees and she has a different opinion on this. In my view, CSR and BHR are two parallel fields with some overlap, but they are distinct. And I think one key difference in my view is that in CSR, the human rights and the rights holders do not matter that much. Rather, it is corporate driven. Companies decide what to do, when to do, how much to do. But in BHR, these are the rights and rights holders who should be driving the discourse. They should be demanding from companies what you should be doing ABC. And of course, there are other elements. Sometimes we say CSR is not binding and BHR is more focused on binding and more role of the state. But of course, it need not be the correct situation all the time, because CSR in India, for instance, is legally binding for some companies, you know. So Justine, I want to ask you, how do you see the relationship of CSR and BHR?
Well, I agree with what you've said, but I also think about it in my mind. I often think about business and human rights as being part of the core business of the company, so that they are integrating concerns around human rights into the way that they operate. And CSR, I often see as something that they add on, philanthropic endeavors, something that is great that they do, but there's not actually an obligation often to do it, and it supplements the main work they do. There's a comment I see that someone's talking about CSR in the Philippines is things like tree planting and medical missions and philanthropic endeavors. And that's what I think about with CSR, those sort of all great things, but they're add-ons. And BHR, as Voltaire says, is this basic respect for business, and they show this by integrating into their operations, respect for human rights.
Very good. So I think it seems that you're able to connect with what we are saying. I see a question that CSR can also be a way to improve corporate or brand image. Can the same be said about the BHR? Yes. So in fact, we'll talk about it later, that we increasingly talk about the business case for human rights. So companies, in fact, CSR, and I think that's why we are saying old wine in new bottle. So the idea, there is an overlap, because CSR is also about going beyond shareholders. And BHR is also going beyond shareholders. But how do you go about it? I think that is a key difference. Sometimes I also try to explain that sometimes CSR could be about how you spend your money. As a company, you make profit, and then you can decide how much of your profit you would like to spend and in what way. But BHR is fundamentally about how do you make profit in the first place. Because you cannot exploit workers, pollute the rivers, and make money and then donate it. That will be inconsistent with the idea of business and human rights. But of course, CSR can be with that. Now, I would also like to differentiate with a couple of these other concepts, which you may be aware or you should know. One is corporate philanthropy. And I think this is very easy to differentiate, because in philanthropy, you're talking about ad hoc donations, giving back something to society. It could be starting a new school, hospital. In India, you have big industries. They establish some cities like Modi Nagar, as you know, is established by Modi, right? So you start your colleges, hospitals, universities, you plant trees. But this is very much voluntary, ad hoc. There is no plan about it necessarily. Then you also have this idea of triple bottom line. And as you will see on this slide, it is about striking a balance between three issues. So of course, for companies making profit, economic considerations are very paramount. But what we say under triple bottom line is that you can't merely focus on making profit. Because if you ignore people, if you ignore the environment, perhaps you may not be able to even make profit in the long run. And the current crisis, the COVID crisis, is telling us this to some extent. Because if you look at the level of inequality, so if the companies paid reasonable living wages to their workers, then those workers would not be in such a bad condition now. The migrant workers, whether you see them in India, whether you see them South Asia, or they are stuck in Gulf area, So I think that is the idea here, that we try to strive a balance. And of course, the ideal situation is here. But this may not always be the case, because you see this is a very tiny space. But even if this is somewhere here or here or here, this could be fine. But I think the difficulty is with this red part. If companies focus merely on profit, I think that is highly problematic. And I think that is what we need to understand. Now, moving on.
Can I ask you one of the questions that came up? It said, do you agree that CSR should be part of statute, as in India, or do you think it should be voluntary?
That's a very good question. I think, in my view, CSR should be obligatory, but I don't want to call it CSR. So I would say that the human rights obligations of companies should be legally binding. They must do ABC, and beyond that, it should be voluntary as well, because the law is going to set the minimum threshold that you must do this much, everyone. If they want to go beyond it, that is fine. But I think the difficulty with the Indian law is that they call it CSR, and it is not rights driven, because the government has put certain activities in the schedule that you can spend your money here and there. And I think it doesn't work in this way. My last concept for now is RBC, responsible business conduct. So responsible business conduct is slightly wider than BHR, because here we are looking at issues which are not typically considered part of human rights, though there is a nexus. So let us say corruption issue, anti-competitive behavior issues, or there are issues about evasion or avoiding tax. And those are the issues which are quite relevant for human rights, because if a company does not pay tax, the government will not have funds to promote human rights. So there are always connections. If there's a corruption, that will undermine human rights, because people will not be able to access, let us say, right to information. They will not be able to get their basic needs, which the government is providing them, let us say. So I think those connections are quite relevant. And within the European context, European Union, this concept of RBC, responsible business conduct, is increasingly becoming very normal. In the context of India, I would like to mention that the national guidelines are now called National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct. So they are national guidelines on RBC. So I think that is again the connection. Justine, anything you want to say before we go with the first question for the poll? Anything you want to add so far?
Well, I think one of the things that's coming up in the questions is sort of the relationship of business and human rights and law. And I think business and human rights, some of it is law, but it's a broad concept. So it sort of includes something what we might call soft law. So that's things like guidelines and something we'll talk about shortly, the UN guiding principles. But it also includes a concept of law. So companies don't have any choice about whether they should be obeying labor laws. But there's the broader concept is basically the idea that business and human rights should be rights driven. It should be rights focused, and rights holders should have a say in what it is. And I think it is okay when many of you are thinking about CSR as something more akin to philanthropic nature. And I think that's a clear difference between the two concepts.
I think there's a question about, is there an international convention that binds states to make any laws, particularly for BHR? And I think you will see it in the slides later on that the process to negotiate an international convention is going on. So with this, we would like to get your participation. So if the Oxfam team could launch the first poll question, we would like to hear from you. And once you see the question, then you can share your response, and then we will continue the discussion. I see a question about vendors and subcontractors breaking labor laws. I think they should not be breaking it, because when we talk about BHR, everything is covered. So all the supply chain partners, everyone should follow it. Now, can you see the question?
Yep, the poll question is up.
Okay, because somehow I can't see it, but you can see it, Justine, right?
Yep, I think when you close the poll, then you'll be able to see the screen back again.
Okay, yeah, it could be because of my setting, I think, because I'm sharing my slides.
Yeah,
so it could be because of that, I guess. Yeah.
But everybody can now vote on the poll.
Sure. So all the participants, can you please participate in this survey question about CSR versus BHR? And then we will share the result with you and continue discussing BHR and CSR. Does the responsibility lies with the main company? Okay. So.
Hi, Surya, the poll results are up. Do you see the poll results?
Yeah. So there's 76% say that the concept is an improvement over CSR. 22% say only slightly, and 2% say no, not an improvement.
Okay. Somehow I cannot see the poll or question or the result, but thanks for sharing, Justine. So that shows that there is, now I see the result. Now I see the result. 76% yes, some difference. So that's good. And slightly difference is 22%. So I think we are not yet fully there in terms of making a transformative change, but I think we are making some progress. And I would like to now ask Justine to take lead on this, that why we are talking about BHR more and more. Can you see the slide, Justine?
Yeah, if you just put it through to the slideshow, I think.
Yeah, can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay.
But just, yep, now it's coming up now. I can't see it at the moment. Do you want to try the next slide and see what happens?
Next slide is this. Does it work for you?
I can't see it. Can you see it?
I can see it. So let me try to do it again, perhaps. Probably I can share the screen again.
We can see your presentation, Surya, but try moving it into the slideshow mode once again.
What about it now, Justine? Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Please.
Except it's just one sec, because it's on the corner of my screen.
Yeah.
So if you go, okay. So we're talking about where has this concept come from, and where has it emerged from, this. And you know, as Surya said at the start, this is a concept that you can date back hundreds of years, but there's been a lot more focus on these particular issues in the last 30 to 40 years. But there are some real reasons around why there's this more recent focus, and part of it has been the rise and the rapid uptake of globalization and the spread of supply chains, where we've seen sort of the mode of companies start to change in the way that they outsource production all around the world. And along with that, we've seen an increase in size and power of companies. And this has very much meant there's been a change in focus around the notion of companies and human rights. And if you see this current slide that's up, we talk about the fact that there's the number of companies that you can see up there, that corporations account for 157 of the 200 largest economies in the world, which is just amazing when you think about that. And if you think back, if you think back to the start of the United Nations in 1945, after World War II, all the focus on human rights was focused on states, was focused on governments, because that was all where the power is. And if we fast forward now to the year that we're in, 2020, you can see that corporations have such a strong role to play in our lives. And in many cases, they're larger and more powerful than some of the biggest governments around the world. Can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So you can see with this one, for example, this great picture from Oxfam, which just shows in one sector that in terms of food, that these 10 companies control all these other companies. And it's a little hard to see in this to sort of pick out the exact companies that you'll see. But you can see how power is controlled by very few companies, but it's spread out through this really intricate web. And so one of the questions that we're going to come back to later on is the difficulty of how you might and who you might hold accountable if something goes wrong in a supply chain. And we'll see that part of that is the structure of companies, but it's also that web of companies, the way they operate. So one of the interesting things that started to change in the last, particularly in the last 10 years, has been the notion of companies themselves starting to think about the fact that they have more purpose than just focusing on profit. Now, the primary focus of many companies is, of course, profit. And many companies are focused on their shareholders and their return on investment. But this statement that's up there now was issued by the US, a very sort of powerful industry body within the US, a roundtable on companies, where they're basically sort of coming straight out and saying that companies have a greater purpose than just focusing on profit. They're talking about, one of the things they talk about is that they've got, you know, responsibilities to their customers, to their employees, and to their suppliers and the communities in which they work. So what we're starting to see is a change of attitude, if you like, over the last particularly 30 years of what companies think their role is. And now, this is not all companies by any means. Often it's the very large companies, it's the companies which are consumer facing, that they're brand focused, so they're worried about their reputation. But there's no doubt from sort of the 1970s through 1980s to now that there is a broader stakeholder perspective that some companies take, and they have greater purpose around that. Your thoughts on that, Surya?
Yeah, I think, and I think it also links with, I think, one or two questions, because BHR is not merely about respecting human rights. To respect human rights, there has to be a complete transformation in the corporate culture. And I think that is where this redefining the purpose of a company becomes relevant. So companies, any company, big or small, in India or anywhere else in the world, does not matter. The key purpose should be to serve the society. And when they make the profit, that is also serving the society. So making the profit is one tool to serve the society. It is not to serve only 5% people in society, because that is what the difficulty with the free market economy we have. That you have big companies making billions and billions of dollars, and then we have a crisis like COVID, they come back and say they donate it, give it back to society. Can we create a better system in which companies, of course, make profit, but that profit is made in such a way that it's more inclusive and fair distribution of wealth? I would also like to address one question here. I think this was a question asked by DEVA, and she asked me the question that, can I give an example of differentiating CSR from BHR and give an example from India? So let us say CSR. CSR would be, if you are a company covered by the Companies Act in India, you spend 2% of your profit on any of those activities which are mentioned in the schedule. So that could be giving donation to the Prime Minister's fund. It could be spending money on girls' education. It could be donating it to build a statue of Sardar Patel. It could be anything like this, right? That is CSR. But BHR is that if you have a factory, how are you treating your workers? How are you treating the women who are working as part of supply chain? If your factory is polluting a river, what have you done about it? So that is the key difference. So CSR could be, you can keep on polluting the river and then you donate your profit, but BHR will not accept it. BHR, you have to fundamentally change the power structure. And I think here I would like to bring back Justine again to the purpose idea, and you can move on from here, Justine.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, and doing that, I guess one of the questions that was raised, I think just there by Sudesh, is that does CSR and BHR complement each other? And the example you just gave, they could complement each other really well. That if the company was also taking action to ensure that they weren't polluting and ensure that the community around them had clean water, etc., that will then facilitate the growth of the community and, you know, enable people to be healthy, go to school, find jobs, etc. And I think that the key takeaway to think about is that sort of by spending money on CSR, that doesn't make up for the deficiencies of BHR. So you can't sort of buy your way out by donating money to a charity if you're not ensuring that you're respecting human rights in your core business. Ideally, they complement each other and work well together, but CSR doesn't make up for the lack of BHR in relation to that.
Yeah.
And I think this statement of purpose is the idea that companies are starting to think that they have to do, you know, that they have to focus on these things more. Now, one of the things we'll get to is how we make them do that, and are they legally obligated to do that? But what we're seeing at least is a talking of a change. Some companies are acting on it, but not everybody around in relation to this. So then there's now, if you're looking at sort of one of the questions which we've just addressed, is this does the failure of CSR to address irresponsible corporate behavior? And I think that CSR has probably got a bad reputation, in many cases rightly so, because companies have focused on that sort of miscellaneous spending, but not focused on integrating core human rights into their business and not looking after their workers. And so then what we're seeing around this is this sort of, as the CSR movement was very strong for a few decades, there was also this really growing recognition that it had its limits, and that a lot of what was focused of CSR was voluntary. It would be nice if companies do it, but we don't have to make them do it. And so CSR became sort of a very soft concept. And I'd say in the last 5-6 years, people have started to get more visibly impatient with this approach and looking for ways that BHR might become part of law in different parts of the world, which we'll get to.
Yeah. And then I think we will also go back to some of the questions very shortly, but I think it will also be a good idea for you to understand, and we will not be able to trace the history of 400 years or more of business and human rights. But I think on this slide, you see two B words: Bhopal, the city, the very famous or infamous gas tragedy in 1984, and Bangladesh, two South Asian countries, and Rana Plaza episode. So we will go through quickly some of these developments before we engage with some of the questions. So please keep on asking the questions that will provide us the opportunity. So on these slides, we will start with this example post Second World War of the, or perhaps related to the Second World War, the Nazi Germany, the Holocaust. And in this particular situation, you will remember and recall, and if you have not read, you may look at this book, where the involvement of a number of companies is explored. But in this book, it is in particular the involvement of IBM, because IBM, as you know, is a very big company, especially it used to be, and that provided a punching card technology to the Nazi regime in Germany so that they can segregate who has to be targeted, right? Because there was no computer. So how do you do the data and segregation of millions and millions of people? So that punching card technology allowed it. So this was a clear example of complicity. Of course, companies also provided toxic gas, which was used by the regime to kill people, you know. So again, if you have not watched the documentary The Corporation, I think you should watch that documentary or read that book by the same title. Justine, perhaps you may talk about some of the reactions after the post-World War and how the regulatory regimes started emerging.
Sure. So we had the examples of companies being involved in illegal acts in many cases, but then there were lots of areas where you might look at a company and say, maybe technically it's legal, but they seem to be behaving badly. And then this started to get a lot more public interest and awareness in the 1970s. Particularly, there was a lot of focus on big companies like Nestle, who was marketing its products in the developing world as sort of its formula, as a substitute. And it was looking at its marketing practices, and people were unhappy and sort of arguing that how it was behaving was unethical. But at the same time, we saw the rise of power of these really large companies. And particularly as globalization started to get hold, the use of supply chains. So starting in the late 1970s, there was some demand that companies should be regulated. And they were thinking about, should this be globally? Should it be by the United Nations? Should it be by the OECD? Or should it be by the International Labour Organization? And all of these three big, massive global organizations, in different ways, tried to regulate companies. So it wasn't through binding laws as such, but they're trying to set out guidelines and directions to guide more responsible business conduct. So that idea that SURYA talked about at the start of that business should behave more responsibly, then this started to take hold in the 1970s and sort of growing pressure on companies to act in a certain way. So the 1980s, SURYA, you can take that one.
Okay, so I mean, two very landmark developments, and what a paradox. The two significant developments are taking place in the same year. So 1984 is the year when Edward Freeman published his book, where he articulated the idea of the stakeholder theory, you know. So the companies have to listen to the stakeholders, which are a much larger group than shareholders, and the companies have a responsibility towards them. And the same year, we have this Bhopal gas disaster where thousands of people died. So again, that raises critical questions about the responsibility of course, companies, but also of the governments. And I think that case study, the Bhopal case study, is, as you know, Justine, for me, was the trigger point for my interest in business and human rights when I started teaching in Bhopal. So that's how I became interested. So I don't know if you want to share what was your trigger point, Justine, why you became interested in business and human rights. What was your trigger?
My trigger was I was living in the United States, and at the time there started to be news about sweatshops and companies, you know, sporting companies, and Nike was one, were alleged to be using sweatshop labor to make their clothes and their shoes. And I had just started, I'd finished studying in the US, and I was working for a human rights organization. And I started to think about how we should be focusing on companies more than businesses. And in the US at the time, university students, college students were really focused on this issue. And so there started to be demonstrations against companies related to this. And then around this time, I thought, this is what, you know, this is the focus. It was the early 90s, and there was a lot of focus on what companies should do. And that's when I started to work on looking at supply chains and how to progress and look after people's human rights by working with companies rather than just governments.
Yes, and if you want to connect it with the the civil society lobbying against big companies in the mid 1990s, I mean, against Nike, the sweatshop issue, Justine, if you want to continue with that. Because you worked with, I think, Human Rights First. Was it Human Rights First at that time?
Yeah, I was working for an organization called Human Rights First, and big human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty didn't have business and human rights programs at this time. Now they have big programs focused on this, but there started to be more media attention on companies, and Nike was one where there was sort of an activist group. Students were some of them who were basically targeting Nike. I mean, social media wasn't really a thing back then, so there was letter writing, they were calling the company, they were protesting outside stores, and they were also concerned that their university, you know, jumpers and tracksuit pants and things like that were labeled with goods that were coming out of a sweatshop. At the same time, there was attention on extractive companies, particularly Shell. So there was a lot of focus on Shell's activities in Nigeria, where they were building a pipeline. And in order to do that, they were basically in a joint venture or partnering with the Nigerian government, and the Nigerian military was providing security for this pipeline. And in doing this, they were forcibly moving people off the land. There are allegations of people being shot, people being tortured, in the interest of protecting this pipeline. So there started to be a lot of global media attention in the old-fashioned way, really before the internet, but in newspapers, and looking at, and people were asking, should companies be allowed to do this? What are they, you know, how can we hold them to account? So in the 1980s, there was this explosion, and 1990s explosion of interest in looking at, should there be ethical obligations put on companies? But there wasn't anything in writing really at that point.
Yeah. And I think we would like to talk about briefly about this very unique legislation in US, because it is only one section, one sentence legislation. But before I do that, I would also like to pick up a question asked by Prani Sharma. So she asking, could you please explain the stakeholder theory by Freeman? I mean, of course, you can read more on this, but in short, this theory is that it is a contrast to the shareholder primacy idea. So there are two ideas. shareholder primacy, which basically means that companies are there only to benefit shareholders. Because in a way, some economists will argue that shareholders own the company, they have invested their money. So the companies should do only to maximize their profit because they have invested. But a stakeholder theory articulates the wider idea that shareholders are part of the stakeholders, but they're others. They're employees, they're consumers. So if employees do not work hard, the company will not make profit. If consumers do not buy things, company will not make profit, right? So shareholders take a risk by investing their money. But employees also take a risk, because if you're an employee, you may take a bus to go to the factory. There is a risk that when you are jumping onto a bus, you might suffer some injury, So everything involves a risk. So why do we overestimate the risk of investors and ignore the risk taken by others? So I think that is in brief the idea of the stakeholder theory, that the company's directors have to balance between the interest of shareholders and other stakeholders. I don't know if anything you would like to add, Justine? Otherwise, we will start with the Alien Tort Claims Act. Anything you want to add on this question or something else?
I think flowing on from what we've talked about the spread of these ideas, there's a question raised by Shiba about, can we blame globalization for the violation of business and human rights, especially in poorer nations? Globalization was a factor, I think, which accelerated perhaps labor exploitation, particularly in supply chains. But if you look at the history of companies going back hundreds of years, there's always been some element, perhaps, of companies being, squeezing money where they can, making profits, and often the worker at the bottom of these, companies is the one that gets squeezed the hardest. So what we've seen with globalization is that this is happening on a much larger scale, bigger effects in more places and over longer periods of time. So globalization has sort of accelerated and exacerbated it. But because of the differences that Suri was just talking about, with a focus on shareholders versus stakeholders, often many companies have a very narrow focus, and it's sort of profit at any cost.
Okay, very interesting question. This is for both of us, Justine, and for me. I think the question is from Pursala. And the question is, can we say that an effort of a company to sell fairness cream for women empowerment education is CSR? And at the same company, if it discontinues production of fairness cream amid a concern of racism in BHR, yes, I think that is a very good understanding, I would say. So if companies, let us say, keep on promoting the idea that fairness is beautiful, white is beautiful in terms of the skin color, and they start marketing their product, they make tons of money, and then they spend part of that profit on some socially good initiative, that is definitely CSR. But BHR would ask this company to fundamentally look at this whole idea of selling this cream, this product. And are you creating and perpetuating a particular kind of bias based on the color of the skin? Same could be said about the tobacco companies, right? So how can a tobacco company, which is going to make profit by selling more cigarettes, do BHR? It's a difficult question, but in my view, to do BHR for a tobacco company, they would have to fundamentally think that can they do business at all? I don't know if, Justine, you have any view on this?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things to think about is, what's the purpose of a product that they're selling? Because if you take a broad view, one might say, well, could you say the same about gun companies, that, companies that are producing guns that are then used to kill people? But, guns have a multi-purpose, and there's an argument that some could be used safely, but depends on the type of gun, etc. But something like the example you just gave, where there is this sort of clear notion that the reason that they're selling and marketing this product is basically comes from this, I would say, this sort of root of, perpetuating discrimination. And so then that's a product with really a single purpose, and that BHR would ask for a company to take account for that. So one thing to think about is also, how is the company making the product? Is it a purpose? And then is it being misused? We're seeing that particularly at the moment, a lot around surveillance products and technology. That surveillance might have a particular use, and then a government or a company is using it in a different way. So how do we deal with that? And one might be also to think about, what is reasonable? What would, when you're making and marketing this product to a certain government, are you assuming that they're going to use it for, surveillance of people in a way that would not be consistent with human rights?
Yeah, and I think as we are speaking, we are triggering interesting questions. There's a question by Rakesh that, is it not possible to do liquor business and weapons business and tobacco business without violating business and human rights principles? And I think my response would be that some businesses are dual purpose. Let us say guns, companies who manufacture and sell guns, So guns can be used in a positive way, but guns can also be used in a negative way. So I think dual purpose business, the company has to take a responsibility that they minimize that adverse impact. But if some products have a singular purpose and dominant purpose is resulting in violation of human rights, let us say Pepsi and Coke, if they are selling sugary drinks, and that contributes to obesity in a particular country, that company should be asking a fundamental question. You can sell drinks, but can you sell drinks in a way which is more healthy and which respects the right to health? I also want to touch upon a question asked by Soumya Bajpai, and we read all the questions, but the difficulty is we have limited time and the questions are hundreds and hundreds of questions. So trust us, we are reading all the questions, but we are not able to answer all the questions. But Soumya asking a question about COVID-19 and BHR. And I think I would also suggest to you that this is only first webinar. We have a dedicated webinar on COVID. And probably, Justine, you will be part of that, right? So we will try to pick up some questions later as well in those dedicated seminars. We are just starting the broad introduction of this field with the first seminar. And we are trying our best to respond to some of the questions that you are raising. But let me now move on to some other issues that you see on the slides. And as I mentioned earlier, all these slides will be shared with everyone, so no need to copy the slides. So you will see this, that in the mid-1990s, many cases started being filed against companies from all over the world in the US. And this law was Alien Tort Claims Act. In fact, is still there. But because of several Supreme Court decisions, which I will not go into details for now, the law has become almost very limited use now, but many cases were filed. And one prominent early case was this case against serious violations of human rights by US subsidiary Unicol, and there was a French subsidiary of Chevron as well in elsewhere, So Total was French company based there in Myanmar. So there were a lot of issues about the forced dislocation about this law. Now let us go to other initiatives. Probably, Justine, you want to speak briefly about the Global Compact and the UN norms?
Sure. So with this growing pressure that we were seeing and sort of people getting frustrated with CSR, there started to be sort of more global movements about trying to get consensus on what should happen. And in 2000, the United Nations launched the UN Global Compact. And the idea of the Global Compact, which still exists today, is that companies would sign up to sort of agree that they would adhere to human rights, labor rights, environmental rights, and anti-corruption processes. And the idea is that companies would internalize this within their corporate culture and report publicly back to the United Nations. And the Global Compact is a useful initiative, I think, as a peer education initiative. It brings companies together with each other to talk about what they do. It often brings civil society in to have some debates about that. It's not, and it was never meant to be a real accountability or liability mechanism. So it's an educational mechanism, and it basically helps solidify the idea around, what companies should be thinking about behaving ethically and responsibly. Around the same time, there was a different but parallel movement that was started to try and almost develop a global law, something like a treaty to focus on business and human rights. And these are the 2003 UN draft norms on the responsibilities of companies. And this was really an earlier version of what we'll get to later on about a treaty that's now being debated around here, with the idea that voluntary measures might not be sufficient. This draft norms was debated, and there was quite a bit of drafting going on. In the end, the United Nations didn't fully accept them. They put them aside, and what they did instead was move on eventually to appoint a UN Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, and then from that also have a UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, which SURYA is a member. So this is to show that the UN, the ILO, the OECD, we're all starting to get, the major institutional functions of the world, we're all starting to get more focused on these issues and bringing governments and employers and advocates together to debate what's the best way to set up regulation in relation to it.
Yes.
Then in the background to all this, at the same time, you've got all of this other advocacy going on, particularly by civil society and human rights advocates. It was environmentally focused, human rights focused. You saw the start of a lot of initiatives, multi-stakeholder initiatives. So bringing, when I say multi-stakeholder, I mean groups that would bring together companies, bring together civil society, sometimes unions, sometimes governments. But there was this acceptance that there needed to be more of a focus on corporate accountability, how to hold companies to account for the wrongdoings that were going on around the world. So things like Shell and Nestle, all of those sort of big focus attention, but there were thousands and thousands of other companies. And so we started to see the development of stronger movements by NGOs and civil society, and also the development of things like fair trade. So the idea that a company might work within its supply chain and try and look at about how prices are paid to farmers and sort of increasing prices as they filter through supply chains. So these are just, you know, in this slide, you can just see some of initiatives that have happened in the last 30 years. You know, and they've often been very sector specific. So focused on a particular issue, like the production of rugs or the productions of footballs, or diamonds, or forests, like illegally logged timber. And there were many organizations which grew up with a really sector specific focus as we went along.
And I guess that brings us also to 2011, where a landmark development took place in this field, and someone was asking a question about the UN guiding principles. And remember, we will discuss this a little later today in the webinar too in detail. But for now, suffice to know that this was the first document coming out of the UN, a soft standard, but unanimously endorsed by all Human Rights Council members. It was drafted by the person you see on the picture, Professor John Ruggie from Harvard. And in that year also, this UN working group was established, which have 5 members from different regions, and I represent Asia Pacific in that group. And our mandate is to disseminate and implement these UN guiding principles. And one tool that we have suggested for governments to do is to develop national action plans to implement UN guiding principles. In Asia, we have Thailand so far. Again, there is a specific webinar focusing on this, but for now, very briefly, Thailand already has a national action plan, and some other countries like India and Pakistan and Japan and Indonesia and Malaysia are working on developing a national action plan, and hopefully we'll have more of those documents in coming years from Asia. Then I think these two interesting developments, one from Pakistan and one from Bangladesh, and probably Justine, you have done quite a lot of research writing around Rana Plaza. So if you want to talk a little bit about Rana Plaza and Kick case in Pakistan.
Yeah, so these two really significant failures sort of focused the world's attention on the lack of human rights and respect for workers in supply chains. So first there was a fire in Kick's factory in a German company in Pakistan in 2012. And if you look at the history, particularly in the ready-made garment sector in Southeast Asia, there's a history of failures. Of workers being injured, of workers dying on the job, and particularly fire, where workers are locked into factories. There's no fire escape. And if you look at some of the factories themselves, they've often got huge mounds of clothing, and they don't meet basic occupational health and safety standards. So there was a fire in a factory in Pakistan that got some attention, but you'll see that there is this history of these failures. And then in April 2013, the Rana Plaza factory collapsed in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, killing over 1,134 workers. And this was a massive failure of human rights and corporate responsibility on such a large scale. That we'd had Bhopal happen in 1984, and then nearly 30 years later, where had we got to? We've got Rana Plaza, and we have more than 1,000 workers dying. And the question then became, how do we, what's changed? How might these companies, whether it's the local factory in Bangladesh or the companies further up the supply chain, is there a way of sort of holding these companies to account for these failures to care for their workers with it? And so at this point in 2013, there was this renewed interest in trying to sort of move away from the concepts of CSR and think about how we might regulate this in a more structured way to talk about BHR.
Mm-hmm. And many other things started happening. And in 2013, for instance, this corporate human rights benchmark was launched, which kind of ranks, started with 100 companies, and now they rank 200 companies in top companies in different sectors, that how they are respecting human rights. So you can Google it and you should be able to see the ranking, but this is quite significant. And such ranking has been started, or such benchmarks are taking place in different sectors. There are also other initiatives which we are not able to discuss everything. For instance, there are initiatives to track, know the supply chain, for instance, right? You should know who are the partners in supply chains. I remember when I started teaching this course, the big companies, Nike and others, they will not disclose the name of their suppliers on their websites. Now, these big companies have name of all their suppliers listed on their websites. This is a major shift in the corporate transparency and awareness, that we are willing to share the list. Earlier, they will say this is a trade secret. We will not share who are our suppliers and from which countries they're coming. That brings me to a question, and hopefully someone can respond to that. Many of you who are participating in this webinar, you should be using a smartphone. And whether you're using a smartphone or Apple or Samsung or Xiaomi or any other company, my question is, how many suppliers you think are involved in making an Apple phone? Give us the random number. Put it in the question in the question box. Give us a number. How many suppliers may be randomly involved? Some of you in the questions are asking us about the treaty initiative, and as you'll see, and we will talk about it later perhaps, but this initiative started in 2014. This slide is interesting because you see a clear division. The countries in red, or who have red color, they are against the treaty idea, binding rules, and the countries in green are supporting. So what you will see is that most of the countries that are supporting are the countries which are developing and from the global south. And the red ones are the developed countries from the global north, and there are some countries in white as well. So it's very divided project, is still going on. We do not know whether we will have this treaty, but there is increasing push to have such kind of a treaty. And I think there is a growing realization that we need binding rules. And even if we don't have a treaty, I think in Europe, especially in Europe, there is this emergence of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. And you will see several countries that is happening. And recently, European Union, a commissioner for justice has made an announcement that he may introduce a legislation, a regulation for the whole European Union in 2021. The interesting aspect of that law will be that even if it is going to be enacted only within Europe, it will have implications for companies operating outside Europe. So let us say an Indian company or a Thai company or an Australian company, if they would like to do business in Europe, they might be captured by this. So this law will have what we know as extraterritorial effect. Perhaps you can briefly mention about the modern slavery, Justine, here, UK and Australia, and then we move on to the second poll question, perhaps.
Sure, and then you're going to have to give an answer to the suppliers, because there's guesses from 2 to 50 to 12,000. But the idea to think about what Suri just raised is that if we have, so Australia now has a new law called the Modern Slavery Act. And what this requires is that companies operating in Australia, they may be Australian companies or foreign companies, but they have to every year make a public report on the risks of modern slavery in their supply chain. So modern slavery includes things like forced labor or bonded labor, where people have paid recruitment fees for the work, or it might include trafficked workers. So what that means is that Australian companies have to do it, but it also catches their supply chain. So they have to look at the risks of their supply chain. So if the T-shirt that they're getting is coming from Bangladesh, well, it will go through multiple suppliers. So the Australian company will be asking their Bangladesh suppliers and all the ones in between, and perhaps the cotton is coming from Turkmenistan, to basically say, has there been the use of forced labor or modern slavery in this product? So although it's mostly a report, it's a reporting technique. It's not a, holding everybody into account for that, but it's again creating awareness of the idea of this. So Australia has this act, the United Kingdom has this act, France and Netherlands have new laws around the idea around supply chains. And there's also ones, as Surya said, being debated in the EU, Hong Kong, Canada, the US. And the idea is that what you're trying to do is get these brand and lead companies to try and take responsibility for increasing understanding of what's happening in their supply chains.
Yeah. In terms of my question about how many suppliers for the iPhone or any smart product, interesting responses from 2 to 12,000. So that's really a big variation. But I think the real numbers is somewhere between 700 plus to 800. And that shows how complicated the supply chains could be. And if we ask you how many companies you know out of these 700, no one knows. Even I don't know, to be honest. And I think that is the challenge in the business and human rights field. So, for instance, someone in Samsung told me once, and I remember it very distinctly, that Samsung makes more money if iPhones are sold, because some of the parts that are in the iPhone are provided by Samsung. So it makes money whether a Samsung phone is sold or an Apple phone is sold. So I think it's very complicated, this particular dynamic. So let us move on. And there are key issues emerging. COVID is definitely one of that crisis, but there are issues about automation, artificial intelligence. I'm sure in many countries, the governments are using an app to track the COVID. So that raises issues about privacy surveillance, the issues about climate change. So all these are big business and human rights issues, which some of these issues we will cover later on in this course in other webinars. But I think this is a time for the second poll question for you. So Oxfam team, if you could please flash the second question, that would be excellent. Thank you so much.
Sure, Surya. Before plugging in the next poll question, can I request you to take a couple of questions from our participants who are joining us through the Facebook Live?
Yeah, why don't, can you read the questions to us? That would be excellent. Please. Let's do that.
Yes, please.
So that's very good. So we have 250 plus people here and some more on the Facebook. So let us get some questions from them, please.
Yes. So one of our participants, Pranav, is asking, is it possible that India banning Chinese apps will have any BHR related impact in India?
I mean, it can. For instance, if it reduces access to something, let us say access to information is a human right. So if banning those apps results in some breaches of human rights, then one could argue. At the same time, one could also ban the apps to promote human rights, because if a particular company is sharing the data for marketing purposes or sharing the data with the government of China, and then it may target those consumers or people who are using it. So it could go both ways. That is what I'm trying to highlight. So it's very difficult to answer this question. It's an open-ended question, but yes, decision to allow these apps or the decision to ban these apps, both will have human rights implications. And I think that impact assessment has to be done both by the government as well as the relevant companies.
Thank you, Surya. The next question is, I would like to ask, how would one classify the involvement of companies and how they react to socially transforming issues like the Black Lives Matter movement?
So that's a really interesting question, and that brings us to that one of the points we made earlier around the purpose of a company. And if you had, if the Black Lives Matter movement had sort of come up, I think 20 years ago, many companies might have shrugged and said, we're not interested in being involved in that. Now what you're seeing, and particularly if you look at the current sort of marketing boycott around Facebook in part, is being driven by some of the attention around this, where you've seen some of the world's really large companies like Unilever and others have basically said, this is a core issue for us because our workers are from every race, they're every color. And so it's important for us to respect everybody around the world. And part of what they've been arguing in relation to Facebook is that they're not acting quickly enough to take down hate speech or to take down racist comments. And so they're basically saying, you've seen some of these companies saying, we're suspending marketing on Facebook for a month to basically make a point around this. So, and non-discrimination is a core element of human rights. And so if companies are taking this seriously, as many are, then they're sort of the issues that are raised by Black Lives Matters are very much core to what they do and how they operate.
Thank you, Justine. One last question before we move on to the poll question by Satya Bharti Mishra. It says, kindly throw some light on the United Nations norms on the responsibilities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises.
I think we briefly mentioned that. So these were the norms which were proposed in 2003, and they have not been approved. So as part of soft international law making, they're still there. And if you look at closely the 2003 norms and the UN guiding principles, even if it looks like that they are talking about two different things, there is a lot of influence of 2003 norms on the UN guiding principles drafting and the treaty process that is taking place now. So that is how soft international law and hard international law develops in a dynamic manner. So those are not legally binding because they were not adopted, but they are influencing the process to move forwards towards legally binding obligations. And Aisha from Pakistan, I am reading your questions and reading all the questions. The difficulty is the time. So probably, but I will take your question that all Ali Enterprise fire case, which took place in 2012, had their findings report ready yesterday. Don't you think that delay in finding the justice process compromised the due diligence? Yes. In fact, I was not aware of that. This report is out yesterday. So thank you for sharing that news that Ali Enterprise fire report is out. And I would like to share that this case was also litigated in Germany against the German company KIK, for which this Ali Enterprise was manufacturing these clothes. And the Ali Enterprise, some of these victims got some money in compensation, but I think it's not an effective remedy because no accountability has been fixed on the company. So I think we are making some progress, but we are still not making enough progress to hold companies accountable. I'm conscious of the time, so we have about 20 minutes left. So let us quickly do this second poll question, Oxfam team, and then we try to finish some more slides, Justine, if that is okay.
Yeah, let's do the poll, and then we might go straight to this question 5 slides, I think.
Yeah.
So the poll question is live now. Participants are requested to kindly submit their responses.
Thank you. So we can see that poll question up there. Will a new UN treaty on business and human rights improve corporate accountability? Yes, partly, no. So this is the idea that we would have a global law that around business and human rights that might find a way to hold companies accountable. But we'll see in later webinars that this is a really difficult and complicated subject because most human rights treaties, all human rights treaties, focus on governments, not companies.
So far, I think it's about 60%, 58 to 60% saying yes, it seems. But let's see the final poll result. Okay, so the poll result is out. 58% saying yes, 37 saying partly, and 5% saying no. So does it tell us something? Justine?
Yeah, well, I think what it tells us is that the students are exactly right in their sort of the realizing that this treaty would be very complicated, and it won't be a sort of a magic solution to problems. It may well advance and help things, but you can see that it's going to be very difficult to make a treaty effective against companies as opposed to governments.
Yeah. All right, so we are going to start with the slides again. So I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it now. If you just put it in slideshow mode.
Okay, and I'm trying to turn it into the, but somehow I'm not able to do that. So I don't know what's going on here.
So one of the questions we're going to, as SURYA works on that, is our final questions, because we've only got about 15 minutes left, is what we've done today is given you some of the history and how thinking has changed around this concept around human rights. But one of the questions we sort of ask, the basic question we ask is, should companies have human rights responsibilities? Because if you look back at this quote that's on the slide now, back in 1970, there was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Milton Friedman, who said that basically the only social responsibility that companies have is to basically use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. And that's often where people stop the quote. But if you go on to read the quote, it also saying that companies basically should stay within the rules of the game, basically engage in open and free competition. And one thing I would argue now is that the rules of the game have changed very much from 1970 to 2020. That people think differently about companies, that they put more purpose on them, that they think they have this greater societal expectation on companies to act in a certain way and respect human rights. So what we would find now, I think if we took a poll of the people outside, is that if you were asked in 1970, do companies have social purpose, there would have been a very mixed response. But I think today that you would see easily a majority of people who believe that there is some social purpose that companies have.
And I think there are different arguments made. Why should businesses respect human rights? And I think there was a question earlier. And I don't know, I'm struggling to start the slide show, but hopefully you can see it. There's a business case argument, and the business case argument is that basically a company can maximize profit or make more profit by respecting human rights because they can manage the adverse impact. I don't know if you have seen this documentary Super Size Me, because this was targeting junk food industry, or if you look at the Body Shop, because Body Shop built its business around doing something, no animal testing, pro environment, pro planet, you know. So I think that creates a lot of interest in terms of what is better for the society. Justine, about the UN guiding principles, what is their logic and social license, if you can quickly touch upon that.
Sure. So what we mentioned earlier was there was this sort of pivotal moment in the development of business and human rights in 2011, when the UN launched the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And this sets out clearly that the companies have, sort of governments, states, as we would say, have legal obligations to protect everyone's human rights, but they also say that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. Now, the key difference here is that the UN Guiding Principles talk about law as the basis of government's responsibility, but in terms of the corporate responsibility, they say that this is embedded in social expectations. So it's not, you know, it's sort of a, no, it's not that hard notion of companies having legal liability for all of these things. And so it's the idea that we as the public, as consumers, as activists, expect companies to behave in certain ways, and there's the development of norms that companies are now starting to respect in relation to that. So I think it's not so controversial now to say that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. What's more controversial is about how they should do that, and to the extent which legal liability might be attached to that responsibility. So one of the key questions that we have is that if we think that they should have human rights responsibility, how do we define that? To how far does it go? So we've been talking about supply chains, a company that's doing something at the top of the supply chain, what's their responsibility? So this slide, you can see that we've given you some examples to have a look at, and we might briefly just sort of talk through our thoughts on how companies should react to each of these. So you want to take the first one?
Yeah, I mean, so the first situation you see here is that you have this car manufacturing company, and it does not allow, it is operating in a state which does not allow women to drive cars, and it criminalizes homosexuality, right? So the question is, what is the connection you see here between a car manufacturing company and the gender discriminatory laws and policies? So in the typical traditional sense, company might say, oh, gender equality issue, but companies nowadays would connect it. So if there are more women who are able to drive cars, they would see that there are more cars may be sold, right? So the question is, who is using your product? And if by using your products only you are perpetuating gender inequality, so you are perhaps linked somehow with those gender discriminatory practices in society. So what should you do? You should use your leverage. You should talk to the government departments. You should raise more awareness in society. You should talk to the suppliers. You should do some campaigns. Your cars that you sell may have some stickers about it, you know. So companies can take innovative means to fight these discriminatory social practices. Perhaps you can pick any one of the other example, Justine, and then we move on.
So maybe we move on to the second one. We see this example here where we have a bank company, a bank who's providing a loan to a different company. Now, it's the second company, Y company, which is basically going to use that loan to build a power plant, which would then displace 10,000 Indigenous people. So here you have company X. It's not physically sort of creating the harm, as you like. It's not directly involved in it. So the question is, are they contributing to this problem? And clearly they are, because they would know the purpose of the loan. And so the question then for X is, what sort of due diligence are they doing in relation to Y? Are they asking questions about what the company is doing to protect the rights of the Indigenous people, to ensure that there's not forced relocation? So there's clear responsibilities and obvious responsibilities and legal obligations on Y. But the question is for X, that if they are doing the right due diligence, then they should be pressuring and using their leverage on the company before they give the loan, to find out how it's going to be used and what safeguards are in place.
All right, so I mean, we are running out of time, but we also wanted to mention this case about Facebook. I think Justine earlier mentioned about Facebook situation. And I think one issue that Facebook has been dealing with, so many issues like interference in democratic elections and all this, but on this slide you will see issues about potential genocide in Myanmar. And if the Facebook platform is being used to perpetuate those serious violations, what is the responsibility of Facebook? And increasingly, these companies, social media companies, and whether these are Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp group, these companies increasingly have to accept that they have a responsibility. They can't merely say, oh, we are merely a platform and anyone can post anything. We have nothing to do with it. You know, it is something similar to the gig economy, like Uber and all these companies. They may pretend, oh, we are not owning these cars. These drivers are independent contractors, and what happens to them, we have nothing to do with it. But increasingly, there is more and more pressure and expectations on these companies to behave in a responsible manner and respect human rights in those situations. And I guess that brings us to the next question, which is about there are a lot of issues, but I think one issue which we want to quickly highlight on this slide is that when you have a complex corporate structure, you have the parent company sitting here and you have so many subsidiaries and joint ventures spreading throughout the world, it becomes very complicated to hold a parent company accountable if there is some violation done by a subsidiary here and there. And that's why this direct duty of care principle, which has evolved in several jurisdictions, but most prominently in the UK, is quite relevant. And I think later in the course, someone will talk about in more detail, but I think that is something we will like to highlight for now. This is something we will talk in greater detail in webinar 2, so I'm going to skip it and go to the final question, how question, and Justine probably can talk about a little bit. And let me bring it to this, I guess, because how is the key question, Justine, and what is your reflection on this?
Yeah, so this is, I mean, I think this is the most difficult area in this whole field about how we do this. So I think when we both started work in this area, the focus was on why companies should do it, you know, all about and convincing companies they should. Now there's a lot of companies accepting that they have responsibilities, and many of the public do, but there's not a lot of consensus about how this happened. And what you see here is this picture of all these different elements that may be putting pressure on a company. And so there might be companies that are put pressure on by government regulation. So if a company is operating, say if it's an Indian company operating in India, then it's subject to all the local laws around labor and human rights and health and safety and employee laws. It's a different issue that some of these laws are often not enforced or not enforced well, but we know that they are subject to government regulation. What happens is more difficult is, say, if it's an Australian company operating in India, and there's some questions around, you know, that sort of that chain of liability. So one is by government regulation. Another might be by investors, whether it's by the provision of capital or by, which we just said. So when a bank is providing money or a bank is providing a loan, you know, what questions are they asking about companies? Activist shareholders, the idea that shareholders would bring corporate shareholder resolutions is this area which is starting to take off in some countries, where people who own shares in the company or some investors, ethical investors, are buying shares in the company to basically then from the inside force companies to take a different approach. And we're seeing this particularly in the area of climate change at the moment. Then there's civil society regulation. We've talked about that, the growth of NGOs and human rights activists who have in the last 30 to 40 years put a lot more pressure on companies, and increasingly do today, particularly through the internet and social media. Consumers are another important part. I think sometimes the role of consumers is overplayed. There's a notion that many consumers want to be ethical, but then when it comes to shopping, they tend to opt for this cheapest thing. I think consumers have a clear role to play, but you know, companies and governments shouldn't rely just on consumers to be a regulator. They're a piece of the puzzle in relation to it. There's also workers and employees inside a company and any leverage they might have to ensure a company operates in a more responsible manner. And then the notion that we've talked about briefly, and we'll talk about in other webinars, this concept of human rights due diligence. And due diligence is this concept that's being discussed a lot in Europe at the moment, also coming through the modern slavery laws, with the idea that companies have to think more seriously and do their homework, do due diligence when they're making business decisions. So it talks about the idea that human rights are integrated as part of a business as usual model in the way that companies work. And then finally, what has also got a lot of attention in the last 10 to 20 years is the idea of sort of multi-stakeholder initiatives or private voluntary initiatives. So there's been in this area, there's been this mix of public and private compliance mechanisms. So public mechanisms might be where law and national governments or local governments are using laws, but often they're supplemented, or where law fails, by private voluntary compliance mechanisms. And these have a mixed record. Some have been successful and some have been less than successful.
Yes, so I mean, these issues are complicated in terms of regulation, but I think we need regulation at different levels. We need regulation at the company level, their policies. We need regulation at the national level. And I think we also need regulations at the regional or the international level, because companies are increasingly operating in a transnational landscape, and they have very complicated supply chains. And I think you see that kind of regulatory framework emerging throughout the world. And even if one country is enacting a law, this law may have implications outside the territory of that country. At the same time, when we talk about impact assessment, I think there are some questions to this effect. We are not talking about a situation in which company will not violate any human right at all. There can be some adverse impacts, but the point is, how can you prevent the adverse impact as much as possible and mitigate as much as possible? Because someone was talking about hydropower project in the question, right? So yes, we understand that the hydropower project will generate some positive value. Electricity is there, and because of electricity, you can use a lot of electronic gadgets. You have air con and fridge and all this. But the point is, who is benefiting from it? It reminds me, I visited a coal power plant in Bihar, in India, one of the states in India, 5 years back. It was very striking for me that this 1000 megawatt power plant was not benefiting the farmers on whose land was taken to build this plant. So that is the development we have to question. And the companies have a responsibility to ensure that they don't do that. Again, on this slide, you see a number of initiatives which link back with the web of regulation picture that Justine was talking about. So you have the idea of self-regulation, you have the idea of market forces, and market forces could be civil society campaigns, student unions, trade unions. And I think this is the idea of mostly naming and shaming. And the UN guiding principles, like here, try to shift it from naming and shaming to knowing and showing. But at the same time, in my view, naming and shaming is still relevant, because companies do not listen sometimes. So you have to really put pressure on them. And once you put pressure on these companies, then they are on the table, and then you can discuss with them how to make the change in their behavior. So I think there's a dynamic relation as well. Justine, do you want to add anything on this slide, or anything else you want to talk about how question?
No, I think that's fine. I think we should probably go to the very last slide, because we're in our last couple of minutes.
Okay, so there is this one, and there is one more. This one. Which one do you want to talk about? This one or the previous one?
Yeah, this one. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I think we know that we've raced through this very quickly for you, and we can see that from your questions. You've got many of you got great questions and sort of an understanding of this really difficult area. But one of the things we wanted to talk about in this first webinar is to show you how the movement's grown and where it's come from, but that it's very much evolving. You know, we haven't got to the end of this, and what we're seeing now is that there's a different understanding of why and that companies should have responsibilities, but there's a clear lack of ability to hold them accountable. And this differs country by country, sector by sector, and globally, there's not one magical mechanism to do this. We see a mix of different methods that are being used to hold companies to account, and you're going to discuss these as the week goes on. Sometimes it's lawsuits, so it's judicial mechanisms. Sometimes it's non-judicial mechanisms. It might be naming and shaming. It might be the use of national human rights institutions or national action plans. But we know that remedy in this particular area is inadequate, and that rights holders are not yet being able to provide, be provided a remedy, or in many cases, companies are not being held accountable. So we're not trying to say that companies, shouldn't exist, shouldn't operate. We believe that they play a really valuable part in society, but we also believe that they should be operating responsibly, and where they don't, that there should be a mechanism for account to hold them to account. And at the moment, what we see is there's this vast imbalance of power between the workers often on the one hand, or the communities, and the companies on the other hand. Surya, do you want to finish?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to answer a question. There are so many questions, but thank you everyone for these excellent questions. I wish we had 3 or 4 hours. but hopefully these questions also are reflective that you are understanding what we are trying to discuss with you. Thank you very much for your participation. And hopefully if you listen to the subsequent webinars, you will get a better understanding, because business and human rights is such a wide field. I teach it at my law school, and I'm sure Justin does it. So I teach it for 39 hours. And after teaching it for 39 hours, I only scratched the surface. So we do not pretend that we can share everything with you. The field is developing very fast, but the idea of this virtual course is to raise awareness and your interest. And hopefully, once you have more interest, then you can start reading more material. All these PowerPoints in this virtual course will be emailed to all of you, so don't worry about it. And all these webinars will be recorded and posted online, because we are trying to build capacity on a pro bono basis, so that everyone becomes better, whether these are the government officials, policymakers, corporate executives, civil society actors, teachers, students, lawyers, anyone, whoever can benefit, because business and human rights basically means that it relates to almost everything happening in the world, and it connects with each one of us, and that's why it's very, very relevant for all of us to become more active. We very much appreciate your active participation. Our apologies, we could not take all of your questions, but you can Google both Justine and me and bother us, and we can pick some questions in the email perhaps. We cannot promise, but sometimes. Or we will see if we can save these questions somehow and respond to some of these questions, or probably join the subsequent webinars. Thank you very much. Justine,
Thank you, everybody.
Words?
No, just to thank you, Oxfam, and thanks for the Academy for holding this. And I will see people later in the week.
Excellent. So thank you, everyone. Take care, and hopefully you will join subsequent webinars as well. Take care.
Thank you, Justine, and thank you, Surya. Thanks a lot for your time and taking us through the BHR and introductory session on BHR and CSR. We are coming to closing this session, and we hope to see you in our following sessions as well. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.